Revelation chapter 19, 7 through 9, and 22 through 17. Let us rejoice and exult and give him the glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. It was granted her to clothe herself with fine linen, bright and pure, for the fine linen is the righteous deeds of the saints. And the angel said to me, write this, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, these are the true words of God. The Spirit and the bride say, come. And let the one who hears say, come. And let the one who is thirsty come. Let the one who desires take the water of life without price.
Good. Yeah, please grab a seat. And I will tell you, she may have forgotten that, but Samantha is a willing servant of the Lord. And if you don't know this, she's doing quite a lot in leading us here in worship. And so I just take a moment and say I'm deeply grateful for you, doing a wonderful job, and we appreciate not only her talents, but also her leadership and willingness to serve. So she's a gift to us. Part of why I wanted her to share in that this morning. All right, I'm going to dive in. So this morning we're going to wrap up our Where We Are Heading series about church membership. And I want to do so by asking a simple question. The simple question is, what is a church? See, I've been laying out an argument for why you should consider being a member of Ridgeview Church. But before making that kind of a decision, then maybe we should answer, well, what's a church? And so let me ask a question, and this is an actual question. I want a response. Does anyone know the New Testament Greek word for church, or what it literally means? Anybody know either of those things? Anybody? Do what? The people. Yeah. So the Greek word is ekklesia, and there's several ways to translate it. One is assembly, like an assembly of people, or gathering of people. Yeah, so typically when you see that word, when you come across it, at least in the ESV translation in the New Testament, you're going to see that word translated as assembly. Now, the Greek, the Old Testament wasn't written in Greek originally. There is a Greek version of the Old Testament. You may know that. When you come across the word assembly, like the people of Israel are gathered before the Lord, they're assembled before the Lord, same word, ekklesia. Okay? There's also that word, ekklesia, used when talking about things that are unrelated to a church. For instance, there's a scene that you might know in Ephesus in Acts where there was nearly a riot in the wake of the ministry of Paul. Okay, and when they dismissed that group of people, when the city, I don't remember his exact title, but when the Roman person of the city dismisses the gathering, it says that he's dismissing the assembly, dismissing the ekklesia. And so when we take this to apply it to the concept of the church, we can take it to mean that a church is a group of people who gather or assemble together regularly. We could add that word regularly there in the end. That's why you could call a church an assembly, because it infers that it's happening regularly. And so what are some of the metaphors, real question here again, what are some of the metaphors for the church in the New Testament? There's a bunch of different things that the church is called, or the people of Christ are called in the New Testament. What are some of those metaphors? Anybody got any? Do what? I heard one. I think it was my wife, and then she got nervous. What'd you say? The bride. Yes. Good. What else? What other metaphors we got in the New Testament for the church? This isn't that big of a room. I can see everybody. Body. Yeah, we've used that one. Body. We've talked about that a couple of times. You could call the church a family. You could call the church, it's been called the temple of the Holy Spirit. That was an interesting one because that applies both to individuals and the church. You could call it the building of God. It talks about it being a building and that we are individual kind of bricks in that building. The priesthood of all believers, you could call it a flock. A few weeks ago, we talked about it as branches of a vine or branches of an olive tree. Yeah, so today, I want to have us focus in on one of those for reasons that I hope will become clear. The church as the bride of Christ. Now, I said this is finishing up a membership series, but I think this might be interesting to anybody, whether you're like, hey, I showed up ready for that, or I had no idea what I was walking into. I hope this next little bit, I think this will be hopefully interesting and challenging to you, kind of wherever you're at. But the church as the bride of Christ. What does it mean that the church is the bride of Christ? Well, when I perform weddings, I often have the opportunity to do a charge at the wedding, kind of like a sermonette, which is aimed, first at the couple, but also at kind of everybody that's hearing. And so several times I've done that charge on Ephesians 5. And so if you have a Bible, open up to Ephesians 5 with me. I'm going to open my Bible there. If you ever need to borrow a Bible, if you need a Bible to take, there's ones by the doors out to the parking lot. If you need a Bible to borrow, there's hardback black ones on the table right over there. You're always welcome to grab one of those on your way in if you need one. But Ephesians 5. Now we're going to skip down to the bottom part of Ephesians 5, the section that, at least in my ESV, if I can ever get there, here it is. In mine, it's titled Wives and Husbands. It starts in this ESV translation in verse 22. However, I think verse 21 can be added in as well, and so I'm going to start there. I'm not going to read all of this because some of what Paul is saying here, naturally, is explicitly talking about marriage. At least I'm going to read it, but I'm not going to necessarily dwell on it. But there's a couple of important twists that I want you to see when we're talking about God's view for marriage, God's plan for marriage, and then the church. There's some interesting overlap here that I want you to see. So we're going to start in verse 21. Verse 21 talks about multiple parties submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. And that's where I typically will start the charge at a wedding. And notice that before explaining how this relationship's going to function best and different roles and different things, there's a call to mutual submission. And I believe that this call can be for our good. And in Timothy Keller's The Meaning of Marriage, he builds his discussion on Christian marriage around this passage, starting in verse 21. And he says that mutual submission is the very foundation of marriage because love is the opposite of self-seeking. And this mutual submission, it requires things like surrendering your freedoms. For instance, if you marry someone, you surrender the freedom to say, go around and date whoever you want, right? You're committing to just one person. You're saying no to all the rest. But of course, in surrendering your freedoms, in submitting to one another, you gain something better. You're able to experience true love in the human sense. Now, what does that have to do with what we're talking about today? The church is the bride of Christ. Well, there's a fascinating connection that Paul makes between marriage and the church. You're going to see as we work through the implications of submitting to one another. So verses 22 to 24, those talk about this mutual submission from the wife's side. And this is that passage where it talks about that she's to submit to her husband as the church submits to Christ, which is a strong call that I could teach on at some point. And I'm not really going to do that this morning. But I want to be clear. If you read that, don't stop there. There's 3 verses on what's this mutual submission have to do with the wife. There's 9 verses for the husband. So let's keep going. Verse 25, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. It goes on from there. But here I want to point out the woman it says to submit, but she's to submit to the man in response to the fact that the man is to love her, how? As Christ loved the church. How did Christ love the church? Well, there's lots of things we could say there, but for one thing, for starters, he died for her. And so in marriage, I believe that the call to mutual submission is stronger on the husband than on the wife. And so here I'll point out, who wouldn't want actually to submit to something like that? To submit to a love relationship like that. One where you know that you were so loved and so valuable that the other party would willingly, gladly lay down his life for your sake. And to be clear, Jesus didn't just die for the church. He does more than that. He did more than that. He does more than that. So husbands, emulating Jesus, should also care for their wives. Let's skip down a little bit to verses 28 and 29. I'll show you what it says there. It says, in the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one has ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church. Now, do you see the big turn there at the end of verse 29? The husband is to nourish and cherish his wife as he cares for his own body, again, as Christ does the church. And then the whole conversation about marriage changes. It goes on in verse 30, it says, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That's talking about marriage. That's a quotation from Genesis 2. But this is kind of wild. Then, verse 32, he says, this mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. Now, if you're confused, that's all right, because there's a little bit of mixing metaphors and talking about two things at once going on here. And I know there's so much more to be said here, especially on the side of marriage, that I'm going to kind of skip over as I'm kind of blitzing through this passage. But I want you to see this connection that Paul is making. Paul is saying marriage was created by God and intended as a living example of Christ's love for his church. And this connection, I believe it actually makes sense of a couple of the verses a little higher up that I skipped. I skipped verses 26 and 27. So if we go back up there, it says, Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, and that she might be holy and without blemish. Now these verses, of course, those are not talking about what a husband can possibly do for his wife, but about what Christ is doing and what he will accomplish with his bride. Now it gives husbands something to emulate, something to look to and aspire to, but this is what Christ only can do. And so what is it that Christ is leading his bride toward? He's leading us toward splendor and toward holiness, and that we would be without spot and without blemish. Now, I want you at this point, set the marriage component of these verses aside. We can always come back to that. But I want to point out a couple things in relation to how are we supposed to look at the church if it's the bride of Christ. I want you to see this. The church, while imperfect, is called the bride of Christ. And Christ himself has already created her through his actions. He died for us. He's redeemed her from her impurities. And he's in the process of making her holy and without blemish. There's a lot there, right? But that's kind of this relation, Christ and his bride, Christ and the church. But to add a little bit more color to this idea of the church as the bride of Christ, let me fast forward us to the end of the Bible. There's something there that I want you to see on this theme of the church as the bride of Christ. And so if you want, you can turn to Revelation 19. I'll read it. But Revelation 19, well, first in Revelation 18, we see, it's Revelation, kind of toward the end of Revelation. And so in 18, Babylon, which is the archetypal city that's opposed to God's reign and rule. Babylon has fallen. There's a lot going on there. Revelation 19, there is great celebration at that event. And it's punctuated by these verses. Verses 7 through 9, it says, let us rejoice and exult and give him the glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. It was granted her to clothe herself with fine linen, bright and pure, for the fine linen is the righteous deeds of the saints. And the angel said to me, write this, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, these are the true words of God. Now verse 7, right there, Revelation 19, says, the bride has made herself ready. Through the final tribulations, she's purified. She now dresses in white. Again, what's the bride? The bride is the church. Now the story ends, literally the story of the Bible ends or almost ends right here with a wedding between Christ and his bride. Now, total side note here, but I'll just say out loud. This is one of the reasons why I love, to me, having the opportunity, I count it a blessing to take part in officiating weddings. Wedding ceremonies, to me, those are a beautiful foretaste of what is to come for the church. And so I think it's powerful. It's kind of a momentary kind of touching between heaven and earth, or at least it can be in a Christian wedding. But let's go on from there. So we have kind of this marriage between Christ and his bride, and the bride is pure and holy. And then in Revelation 19 and 20, we see, Babylon's been overthrown, and now we see the final defeat of Satan, and then we see the complete reign and rule of Christ established in Revelation 20. And then in Revelation 21 and 22, this is truly the final scene of the Bible. We see new creation. But I want to point out a couple things about how this new creation is described. Revelation 21:2, John says, "And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband." This new creation, or New Jerusalem, is described as what? It's described as a bride. It's this idea of a marriage between Christ and his bride. It continues all the way to the end. And then one more verse on the topic, Revelation 22:17. "The Spirit and the bride say, 'Come.' And let the one who hears say, 'Come.' And let the one who is thirsty come, and let the one who desires take the water of life without price." And I love that. It's the Spirit and the bride of Christ, the church. At the very end of the Bible, we see them together saying, "Come to the spiritually thirsty." It's what we see in the beginning of the Bible, that God gives his people freedom to co-rule and reign with him as his under-kings. We're given dominion and authority and value. And then it's what we see in the New Testament, that though the work of salvation is done by Christ and the power of salvation is brought by the Spirit, the invitation of salvation is a team effort between the Spirit of God wooing us to himself and the church, or the people of the church of God, inviting the thirsty. And that's what I want us to be about. I want us to be a church that is saying to the spiritually thirsty around us, "Come and drink. Take the water of life without price." Now, what's my point in all that? Well, for one, that's a beautiful metaphor for the church. And I'm just scratching the surface. I kind of blitzed through some of the church as the bride of Christ stuff there. And so I would invite you to go on thinking about that and considering, what does it mean that the church is described as the bride of Christ? What are the other implications of that I didn't even touch on? Go look up the other scriptures on it and just read it and sit with it and be like, gosh, that's a very intimate way of describing, that's a very intimate metaphor, is it not? There's more to it. But the other thing I want to highlight is that calling the church the bride of Christ is an invitation into a covenant with God. Now I want to talk about this idea of covenant for a minute. What's a covenant? Well, one definition for a covenant is it's an agreement or mutual obligation contracted deliberately and with solemnity. Now marriage is often, and I think rightly, called a covenant. There should be, there's an agreement. There should also be a deliberation that is contracted deliberately and with solemnity. That's part of why marriage ceremonies are the way they are. There's at least somewhat of a solemn atmosphere to it. It's because it's a big deal. Here's the thing about covenants. They typically expect both sides to make concessions and commitments to the other. And if either side doesn't fulfill its end of the bargain, then the agreement is or can be called off. But here's the crazy thing about the covenants with God, between God and his people in the Bible, and there are several. God promises to be faithful, and he cannot go against that without going against his own nature. And so even though he does that, even though he knows that we will not be faithful. Isn't that crazy? Like, God still covenants with his people, even though he knows that his people aren't going to be faithful. I want to show you a couple of examples of this. So, in the covenant with Noah, this is the first really explicit covenant in the Bible. God doesn't even ask Noah for anything in return. Okay, it's the whole flood thing has just happened, and then Genesis 9, we see this. And what happens is God just says to Noah, "Hey, I'm going to make you a promise. I will never again destroy the world by flood. And then the sign of the covenant, do you know what it is? It's a rainbow. But if you kind of look at it in their framework, it's a bow. It's a war bow that's pointed where? Well, it's pointed up. It's pointed at the sky. It's almost as if Noah's supposed to see that rainbow and be reminded that God is pointing the bow at himself like that, saying, if I'm not faithful, this bow will be fired at me. Or consider the covenant with Abraham. Now, sure, God actually does ask Abraham for faithfulness and obedience. There's a lot going on there. But when they actually cut covenant together, you can read about this in Genesis 15. God causes Abraham, they cut some animals up and lay them out. There's this pathway. God causes Abraham to fall asleep while he alone walks the path of committing himself to faithfulness, or else. In that framework, the idea of a covenant there, but walking between animals that have been cut up, was, if I'm not faithful, let me become like one of these animals. God walked that path, and he caused Abraham to not walk that path. Or consider the new covenant, which was forged by the blood of Christ. God didn't just promise to take the fall for that one. He set out to do so to win you back to himself. The new covenant in Christ only exists because God sent his son to die in our place on the cross. And we did nothing to set that covenant in motion, except for possibly, you could say, we took part in his killing by our sinfulness. So that's how these covenants work. But who does God make the new covenant with? Well, he makes it with his people, the church. Or again, the language we're using today, the bride of Christ. As in, not just individuals. Now, to be sure, the church is made up of individuals. But the covenant is made with the body as a whole. And so therefore, the relationship between God and his people is like the covenantal relationship of marriage. Now, from all that, I think we can deduce a couple things about being the church together. One, being a church member is for Christians. In no way do I want our church to be exclusive toward the world. I want us to be inviting. I want us, Revelation 22:17, I want us to be saying, come, in everything that we do. I picture church members as a group of people who, you could put them in a circle and have them face outward and lock arms, as if it's to say, we're a group of people, we've got each other's back, we got each other side by side, but we're facing outward, not inward. We're focused out, not in. But that said, in order to truly be in the church, you have to first be in Christ. And so when I'm talking about church membership, that's for Christians. The second thing I want to point out is that church membership is, I believe, a covenant. I think that's a good word for it. And you cannot be joined in a covenant built around, say, a core set of beliefs that you don't share. And so it's my belief that churches should be an assembly of a particular group of people who voluntarily join around a particular set of beliefs and ministry distinctives for the glory of God. And there's a little paragraph at the beginning of our membership booklet about that. Now, I made my kind of case for membership, why I believe it matters and it's valuable. I made that a few weeks ago, February the 4th, I believe. Why you should want to be a church member, why I really do believe that church membership is for the individual as much as it's for the church itself. But here's a quick, pithy statement that may help to summarize the value of church membership. I got this from Tony Evans. He says, I hear people say, I don't have to go to church to be a Christian, and they're absolutely right. Salvation is through faith alone, in Christ alone. But you don't have to go home to be married, but stay away long enough, and your relationship will be affected. Now, what I want to invite us into in church membership is committing to one another in the covenant of church membership, recognizing that this means we're committing to not just coming and going as we please, but to the formational influence of that commitment. And here's a reality I want to get out of the way as I'm talking about covenanting together and church membership and all of that. Hey, covenant is not a promise that everything will be perfect, right? If you are married, You may have had this experience that even though you married the person of your dreams, well, things still aren't perfect in that relationship. There's still challenges. And as a church, we're going to be made up of people. And people are messy. And here's a reality. If we're going to covenant together, we're going to mess up. We're all going to mess up. I'm going to mess up. I'll say things incorrectly. I'll lead us imperfectly. I mean, just to be honest, I have to utter the words, I'm sorry, to the people around me far more often than I would like to admit. But it's true. And so at some point, you might possibly mess up or be wrong about something. And that's okay. I want to be clear about this. I'm not saying, hey, to be a church member, you got to be perfect or we're perfect or the whole thing. No, I'm saying church is a place where it's okay to not be okay. But we don't want to stay in that place of brokenness. We don't want to stay in brokenness on purpose. But it's okay to not be okay. So joining a church as a covenant member isn't accepting an invitation into a perfect situation or perfect church or anything like that. That doesn't exist. Joining a church is stepping into the mess that God has moved into first, and then humbly helping to improve that situation by submitting yourself to one another and to being formed by the things that you're gathered around. So where do we go from here? What am I inviting you into? Well, fair warning. I'm about to send a lot of details your way rather quickly. But first and foremost, let me just say this. My invitation, my primary invitation, is to accept the call of Jesus to come and to drink the water of life without price. If you've not said yes to Jesus' invitation in your life, that is my call to you. That's it. That's what we're gathered around. But if you have, and if you've listened to these, today and the past several messages, and you'd say, yeah, I think I want to get on board with these people and this vision and be a part of making that happen, then here's what I'd like to invite you to do. I'd like to invite you to do a few things. One is to read the membership booklet cover to cover. We passed them out last week. We have more out in the lobby. They look like this. In it, I'm going to walk through this. I'm going to do it as quickly as I can. But in it, I want you to know what you'll find when you do. So in it, on page 1, you'll find introductory remarks, things that I've talked about, I've highlighted either in this morning or other recent messages. Pages 2 and 3, you're going to find our mission, vision, and intended structure, which is, I talked about these in the Who We Are series that we did in January. So I'd invite you to go back and listen to those if you missed those, if you want to be a member. Page 3, I've also got a short little version of our story, how we got here so far. Pages 4 and 5, I have our statement of faith. This is on our public website as well. And I would say if you want to be a covenant member, if you want to be a member, then you need to read every word of the statement of faith. If you have questions about it, then write them down and let's talk. I did take this statement of faith directly from our sending church, Southridge, although I did rearrange the information a little bit. Just kind of an ordering of it. Page 6, if you keep going, those are core values of the church. Some of those I've highlighted in the messages recently. Some I have not. All of what's on here is important. Page 7, love and unity. Let me say a quick word on this. This is really around doctrine, but this can be applied to anything. So I've got kind of, when we look at Christian beliefs, I've got them kind of just divided into 4 levels. Levels 1, 2, 3, and 4. Level 1, those are hills we die on. Okay? And what I mean by that is these are non-negotiable beliefs, things that we aren't going to compromise on. These are cardinal doctrines of the Christian faith. It's the gospel of Jesus. It's what's essential for salvation. It's basic teachings of Christian theology. These are areas where we have to be united in these. So those are the hills that we die on, so to speak. The next level, level 2, is hills that we stand on. These are church convictions. And they set various churches and denominations apart. And so a church conviction, the reality is there might be Christians in other parts of the world or even other parts of our town that would believe differently on those things. They would say, here's where we land on this. And we might say, we don't agree. And that's okay. Now, if you're going to be a member here, Hills We Stand On, we are going to want you to be able to affirm those and agree with those. Some examples of those would be our church governance structure, or whether only men may be elders or pastors, or the role of charismatic gifts in the church today, or the mode of baptism. Those would be hills we stand on. Is it possible that we pick a stance on something and we find out in heaven that, we weren't exactly right on that one? Sure, it's possible, but we stand where we stand because we believe that it's faithful. And so those are hills we stand on. Level 3 is hills we dialogue on. Now, this is the realm of theological opinion. These are views that we can hold differently in the body and still worship together and still covenant together. And so things here would be things like viewpoints on, I've been using Revelation this morning, viewpoints on how Revelation plays out and how the end times and all of that. We could actually have different views on that. There's lots of other things that we could have different views on. We could have different views on how faith and politics ought to intersect, okay, and still worship together. Now, I'm not saying that in those things we can't hold our views strongly and believe them. We absolutely can and we should. But those are areas that while we might hold them strongly, we're not going to divide over. Those are hills we dialogue on, we talk. And then level 4 is molehills. These are theological speculation things. And the examples that I have on here are, how old will we be in heaven? Is there a right translation of the Bible? Is there a particular style of worship music that is the best? Kind of whatever. Not that we don't have opinions on those, but we're really not going to divide on those. The point with this is we're going to teach primarily from the top down on this list. We're going to teach mostly about level 1, then about level 2. We'll teach about them kind of in order. And we want to be united around them in the right order. And so we're going to emphasize them in the right order. And we're not going to allow ourselves to be divided over things that are secondary or where there could be a difference in belief. So the next page then, that page 7, is called Love and Unity, and page 8 is Maintaining Love and Unity. Just a couple of aspects of that include accountability and church judgment. I talked about those a little bit, or at least church judgment I talked about a little while ago. Pages 9 and 10 get into those theological distinctives, church convictions. These are things that are going to shape the way that we'll worship together, and some of the boundary lines we will draw. These are kind of some of those hills that we'll stand on. So will we baptize babies? No, we will not. Will we do other things for children? Of course we will, but we're not going to baptize babies. Our church governance structure, the role of women in ministry. We have a brief statement on marriage, gender, and sexuality there, spiritual gifts. Now, all of those things, those are summary statements. And so you might breeze through them, or you might read it and be like, I want to make sure I understand this correctly. So I would say read those. If you have questions, hold that thought, but you're going to be welcome to ask them. Pages 11 and 12, we have the financial stewardship piece, kind of what we would expect of members, what we would commit to you, and all that. I talked about that last week, and so I'd invite you to go back and listen to that. And also on page 12, we have a brief statement about the Ridge Church Network. Throughout this document, you'll also see notes that, hey, check out the appendix on this, or ask for the position paper on that. The appendices, those are going to be found in a document that's called More About Ridgeview Church. You can access that on our website. The position papers are not available online, but we would invite you to, if you have questions and you want to read more, I'd invite you to reach out. A couple of the position papers are, more a starting point for a conversation, but they do illustrate, where we land. All right, now that was a lot. So if you hear all of that and you read the membership book and you're like, hey man, I don't know if I want to be a member. Or if you're like, man, I'm not in that place right now. First off, let me say that's okay. We would still love to have you around. Everything we do is invitational. And so everything that we do is because we want you to grow in Christ. I wouldn't invite you into something if I didn't believe there was value in it. But if you're not there, then that's okay. There will be a couple of places that you wouldn't be able to serve at this point. There might be a few things you can't participate in, but that's okay if you're not there yet. But if you heard all this and heard the messages and the Who We Are series in January and this series, Where We're Heading, and you say, yeah, man, I am in, I want to be a member, then here's the invitation for you. 4 steps here for becoming a member. Step 1, go back and catch up on any of these sermons you missed. And I said this in the past, but in the future, this will all be kind of offered in a classroom setting. So if you're like, hey, I missed all of it except for this, maybe you could go back and catch up, or you could wait till we offer this in a class. Step 2 would be to read this booklet and any related information that you feel you need to read, which I'll talk a little bit more about how to get that. Step 3 would be to fill out a membership interview form on the website. I'll come back to that. That doesn't need to be scary. And step 4 will be to sign a membership covenant. So how do we get that process started? Well, I would invite you to go to our church website, to go to ridgeviewchurch.wv.com/membership. Now, you won't find, if you go to ridgeviewchurch.wv.com, you won't be able to navigate to this site. You have to go directly via the link. And I'll just tell you, I will be sending that link out to our church email list. So if you're in our database, which you end up in our database when you give, when you check your kids in, when you sign up for an event, or when you serve or fill out a communication card, there's a few ways you end up in our database, then you'll get that email. On that website, you'll find, if you scroll down, you'll find 4 documents. You'll find this document, and this is the one document that is essential and we want you to read. There's the More About Us document, the appendices to this. If you came with us from Southridge, you know that the membership booklet at Southridge was like 40-some pages long. And so my goal was to take that and split it into 2 and say, here's the essential stuff that you have to read it to be a member. And then here's the other stuff that we think is really helpful and good and we believe, but you may not have to read every word to it. That's available to you. We'd invite you to read that. There's also a copy of the membership covenant, which looks like this. We'll have those printed, but we just want you to be able to see what's on it, know what you'd be signing. You don't need to show up to sign a paper you've never seen before. And then there's a membership covenant commitments worksheet, and that's just for you. That's to take this and to turn it into, how would I engage with what's going on here? You don't have to turn that in unless you want to. That's totally just available to you. You'll also find, if you scroll down to the bottom, the link to the membership interview form. Now again, about the interview, don't let that scare you. That is a conversation where we can get to know one another better. The questions for that meeting will be the questions from the form, so there won't be any surprises. And the spirit of that interview is not to interrogate you and see if you measure up. The spirit of that interview is, it's a space for you to bring your questions and to ask and say, hey, I was unclear on this. I read this and I think I agree, but can we talk about that? It's a great space for that. It's a great space for us to say, hey, can you tell us your story? How'd you come to know Jesus? We want to know that. And a great space for us to kind of begin, if we don't have a relationship, to build that. So my hope is that wouldn't be intimidating, but rather that it would be exciting. I look forward to having those meetings, the opportunity to meet with anyone who wants to be a member. And that said, if a lot of you want to be members, it's going to take a while before we can get through all of those, right? So that's okay. That process might string out for a little while. And then step 4 was signing the membership covenant. And I would say after you've done those first 3, we can go ahead and let you sign, even if the interview has not been done. But we'll kind of still follow through on that. All right, next to last thing, I just want to tell you what's on the membership covenant. There's 4 affirmations. One of them is that you are a Christian, and the others reference other items in the membership booklet. And then there's 7 commitments relating to items in the membership booklet. I took this document from Southridge Church, and I just kind of split it into affirmations and commitments. And then the only other real change I made, I added a few words here and there, but the only other real change I made was I changed the thing at the bottom. And so if you were ever a member at Southridge, you know that those expired at the end of the year. We're not doing that. So this won't expire unless, you move, you say, hey, take me off the membership, or if you're just generally unwilling or, unable or unwilling to fulfill the above commitments and just don't really have a desire to do that anymore. So that doesn't mean that what that means is we're not going to redo membership every year. It doesn't mean that we won't ever talk about what's involved in membership or what was on that paper. And my hope is that when we bring it up, that it's just kind of a joyous reminder. But you won't have to remember to sign a piece of paper every year, which for some of you, if you came from Southridge, you're like, that's probably good. I was one of those people that would forget to sign it at the beginning of the year. Lastly, I titled this series Where We Are Heading, and so I think it's only right that I tell you what I know of our future plans. The coming weeks and months of this soft launch phase will look similar to the previous weeks and months. We'll continue rolling out new things as we're able, as we work toward a public launch. We'll continue to recruit and train new volunteers and things like that. On Sundays, I'll give you a quick idea that what's coming up on the schedule for teaching. The next 3 weeks, we're going to jump into some encounters with Jesus. We did a few of these in the fall. And so, like I mentioned back then, we're going to do those as kind of standalone Jesus stories. To me, that's exciting. I love to just kind of look at an individual account with Jesus and look at what's the implications of that in our lives. Next week, Pastor Daniel Carpenter from Southridge is actually going to be here. He'll be teaching, and I'm going to go up there. We're going to do a little pulpit swap. Then the week after that, Matt Horn will be here teaching, and I'll be here as well. And so I look forward to receiving the word from Matt that morning, and then I'll be back to teaching after that here in 3 weeks. After that, we'll have Palm Sunday, we'll have Easter Sunday, and then after that, we're diving into 1 Corinthians, which we'll probably we'll do some 1 Corinthians, then we'll probably go to some other stuff. And we'll go back to 1 Corinthians, kind of in and out of that. And then public launch. What we are aiming for is an official public launch on September 8th, 2024. You might be like, that's quite a ways away. Let me explain why. When Southridge asked a consultant, back when this building was becoming a second campus of Southridge, which was a while ago, and there's a whole backstory. If you don't know it, I can fill you in. But when Southridge asked a consultant when to launch a church, they said the 3 best months to launch a church are September, and September. And then they said, and after that, probably either January or Easter. And so, we started our soft launch services in September. We weren't ready for January, and Easter's just a few weeks out at this point. So, rather than publicly launching and then very quickly being in summer, and if you've been a part of a church and serving, and then summer can be a little bit of do we have enough people this week? People are here, there, and everywhere a little bit in the summer, and that's fine. So rather than trying to launch right before that, we're going to take our time. We're going to do our best to be prepared. So that said, as we get closer, we'll do some things in light of launching the church officially to the public. Launching a church or any organization is like a first impression. The first impression, you only get one chance. And so we have some ideas and thoughts that we've been thinking of. Me and some other people have been thinking about how we're going to go about doing that. But as it gets closer, if you have launch ideas or, hey, have you thought about doing this, please reach out. We might have, we might not have, or we might love help with some ideas. So as we get closer to that, we will, get the word out. All right. Now, I know that was a lot. So let me pray, and then we're going to close out our morning with communion. Dear God, thank you that we're able to gather together, that any of this stuff related to being a church or membership or any of it, that it's bound up in the reality that you moved first, that you love us, that you died for us, and that anything we do is only in response to that. So God, I thank you for your goodness. I thank you that you've ordered things in such a way that you believe it's right and good for us to assemble together as churches. And Lord, I pray for this last moment as we enter into remembering what you've done on our behalf, that you prepare our hearts. So today we're going to conclude by observing communion. We're not going to have a final song, and so I want to take a few